So the sign of a degenerating research program is a research program that A, is not solving the puzzles that it was thought that they were going to be solved, because during the historical progression of a theory, it doesn't come out perfect. Theory is improved as time goes on, and it's made more complex. So each scientific theory, like Newtonian mechanics, it started off with just point masses, and Newton further developed the theory so that masses had a volume, so it would better account for the actual motions of the planets. So it solves puzzles. So when a scientific theory gets into some puzzles that it can't solve, that's one sign. The other sign is where it's making predictions, and the predictions are found to turn out to be false. So that's another sign of a degenerating research program. A progressive research program, on the other hand, is one that is A, solving the puzzles it's meant to be try to be solving, and is also making some predictions, some of which are turning out to be true. So a good example of a degenerating research program was Newtonian mechanics. It was blindingly successful in predicting the orbit of Neptune once the theory was adjusted with an ad hoc hypothesis. So Newtonian mechanics to be saved because it was kind of falsified by the recalcitrant orbit of Uranus. So they made an ad hoc adjustment that there must be a planet outside of Uranus. Stunning verification. But the orbit of Mercury was proving a problem. It wasn't accurately predicting the exact orbit of Mercury. So another ad hoc modification was done to Newtonian mechanics. It was postulated that there must be a planet between Mercury and the Sun, an inner planet. And people were looking, it was called Vulcan, this theoretical planet. People were looking and looking and looking and looking for a long time. But it turns out it was never found, it was never going to be found. So with all that looking and looking and looking, that was the marker then that Newtonian mechanics was going into a degenerative phase. Now, we saw that with the discovery of the planet of Neptune, that a theory that looks like it's degenerating can suddenly become progressive if what it's looking for is found. So if the planet Vulcan had been found, it would have been another spectacular success for the Newtonian program, but it wasn't. And this is why, modern Imre Lakatos says you can only evaluate whether a program is degenerating or progressive over a longer period of time, because what looks like a degenerating program can be brought back to life, which is what happened with the debates between those people who thought light was a wave and those people who thought light was a particle. They kind of leapfrogged over each other because at one time one seemed to be the better theory, and then at another time the other theory, the alternate theory, seemed to be a better theory. So Newtonian mechanics finally was given the death blow with Einsteinian mechanics, because with Einsteinian mechanics it accurately predicted the orbit of Venus to a spectacular amount of detail. There was a problem with the advancing perihelion of Mercury. Newtonian mechanics couldn't accurately tell us what that was, but Einsteinian mechanics accurately predicted the advancing perihelion of Mercury. So with the arrival of the new theory, Einsteinian mechanics, and its spectacular success with the orbit of Mercury, once a progressive theory comes on the scene, which contradicts the other alternative, Newtonian mechanics. Once a progressive theory comes on the scene, then we're pretty certain that what looks like a degenerating theory, Newtonian mechanics, we can then say, well, it really is a degenerating theory, because it will never get right the advancing perihelion of Mercury. It doesn't have the theoretical resources to ever get that right. And we can see now that the Einsteinian paradigm, that got it right, and we can see why it got it right, because of relativistic masses and all the other theoretical stuff that Einstein brought to bear. With Darwinian evolution, too early on, two quite stunning predictions that were borne out by Darwin. One was that we will find transitional forms between earlier species A and later species B, and Darwin theorised that this was the earlier form and that was the later form. Darwin predicted that we will find transitional forms between the occurrence of these earlier and later species in the geological layers. That's been done, I think, now thousands of times, literally thousands of times, the finding of these transitional forms. The other prediction is that we will never find a later a version of a species. We'll never find a later version of a species in an earlier geological layer. We will never find that. And now, over 300 more years since Darwin first put his theory out, we have never found that to be the case. So there's another prediction that we won't ever find a later form of species in an earlier geological layer. And this is another really good example of how the Darwinian program was progressive, and the earlier creationist program, which postulated that species are created ex nihilo, separate species, why that became a degenerating program.
Nice. As an aside, do you think that there is any way that we can use to evaluate the health of ethical research programs that we can borrow from the theory of evaluating degenerative and progressive research programs in science?
Yeah, I think one indicator for a progressive research program in both meta-ethics and normative ethics is if we can get moral philosophers who initially disagreed with a moral theory, get them on board and agreeing. So if we find professional philosophers coalescing over time to a particular view, I think that's a reasonably good marker that we're on the right track. The other thing is what John Rawls called equilibria between the posited moral principles and our concrete moral intuitions, and where over time we can bring the two closer together, so we find that there's less and less concrete moral intuitions that disagree with our higher level principles. If the two are coming closer together, what he called equilibria, then I think possibly that's another marker that we're making progress in moral theory. I'll mention here Peter Singer, because Peter Singer disagreed with that. He thought that we shouldn't place too much weight on our moral intuitions because some of them are grounded in our earlier evolutionary history, and they may have served a purpose. These moral intuitions may have served a purpose, like for example, revulsion against homosexual behaviour. That may have served a purpose in primitive societies, but it's counterproductive today in modern democratic societies. So that moral intuition now has to be questioned by our more thought through moral principles. So there's still disagreement on how can we tell when we're making progress.